A racist officer uses pepper spray on a black man, unaware he's the city's new police commissioner. The night air clung to the city like a thick veil, the distant wail of sirens threading through the background noise of restless movement. The streets pulsed with an energy that was neither alive nor dead, just existing in that in-between space where anything could happen. Officer Derek Lawson sat in his patrol car, one hand resting on the wheel, the other lightly tapping against his knee. His fingers moved in an impatient rhythm, his sharp eyes scanning the sidewalk, moving from shadow to shadow, from face to face, waiting, watching, hunting. It had been a slow shift, and slow shifts irritated him. He liked the job best when there was something to control, a drunk causing trouble, a petty thief who needed to be taught a lesson, someone running when they should have stopped. Those were the nights that made him feel alive, the ones where the weight of his badge and the power behind it weren't just symbols but weapons. But tonight, the city was too quiet. The streets had changed over the years, softened by oversight, policies, and bureaucrats who didn't understand what it was really like to police this place. It used to be simple. The badge had meant authority, meant people didn't ask questions, meant that when he told someone to stop, they stopped. Now there were too many cameras, too many complaints, too many people talking about rights and procedures, too many people who didn't know their place. He hated that. And then he saw him. Derek's fingers stilled against the wheel. A man walking alone, crossing an intersection under the glow of a streetlight. Tall, broad-shouldered, his stride smooth and deliberate. He didn't look around nervously like most did when walking alone at night. He wasn't afraid. That was the first mistake. Derek's eyes moved over the details. A dark navy suit, sharp against the muted glow of the city lights. Polished shoes, the kind that weren't scuffed from running or cheap from a discount store. Shoulders back, head high. He wasn't a kid, wasn't one of the usual suspects who ducked into alleys when they saw a cruiser roll by, but it wasn't the suit or the confidence that made Derek's blood heat. It was the way he walked. Not hurried, not hesitant. Like he belonged. That was the mistake. Derek had seen that walk before. A black man moving like the world owed him space, like he didn't need to apologize for being there, like he was equal. His jaw clenched. He nudged his partner, Officer Ryan Carter, who sat lazily in the passenger seat, chewing gum like he had all the time in the world. Ryan looked up, following Derek's gaze. His eyes narrowed slightly, his body shifting forward as he took in the scene. He exhaled through his nose, rolling his shoulders. Derek could already tell Ryan saw it too. Something about this one. Derek could feel the itch rising, that familiar pull in his chest, the one that whispered that this was his city, his streets, his rules. And rules only worked when people followed them. Ryan sat up straighter, already reaching for the switch before Derek said anything. They didn't need to talk. Derek flicked on the squad car's lights. The red and blue strobes splashed against the pavement, cutting through the darkness, bending around the man's sharp silhouette. And just like that, the rules were back in place. Because no matter who he thought he was, this man would soon be reminded of the truth. The red and blue lights flooded the pavement, painting the scene in harsh, flickering color. The city noise dulled into the background as the moment stretched between them, the hum of distant traffic and the occasional honk of a car becoming nothing more than a muted backdrop to what was about to unfold. The man stopped. He didn't jump, didn't tense, didn't look around with the usual nervous flicker of someone who had been in this situation before. His posture remained composed, his body still and deliberate. He didn't hunch his shoulders, didn't shove his hands into his pockets in that apologetic way Derek was used to seeing. That annoyed him. Derek had expected hesitation. A pause, a glance over the shoulder, maybe even a quick explanation spilling from the man's mouth. But there was nothing. Just stillness. Just waiting. Like he had no reason to be afraid. Derek stepped out first, moving with a practiced ease, his boots pressing into the pavement with deliberate weight. He adjusted his belt, making sure his badge was visible, making sure it caught the light just right. Ryan followed a second later, slower, more relaxed, his fingers grazing the handle of his baton as he sized the man up. The air between them thickened, that quiet, suffocating tension that always came before compliance or confrontation. Derek spoke first. His voice carried that carefully measured authority, the kind designed to make people shrink, to make them small before the badge. But the man didn't shrink. His head tilted slightly, not in defiance but in calculation. He reached into his jacket, his movements smooth and deliberate, the kind of control that said he had done this before. Derek's breath hitched slightly, his muscles tensing in automatic readiness. But there was no gun, no weapon, just a wallet. The man pulled it free and started to open it. Derek didn't wait. He snatched it out of his hands, fingers curling around the worn leather, yanking it away before the man could so much as hold it open. The moment his fingers touched it, something inside him hesitated. The weight was wrong. Not thick like a normal wallet, not packed with bills or receipts. It was slim, firm, structured in a way that didn't match what Derek had expected. His thumb brushed over the edge, feeling the distinct gold trim, the smooth surface of an identification card inside. A badge. His stomach clenched, something primal in him screaming that he had just made a mistake. But Derek didn't look. He didn't check the name, didn't read the words printed on the ID, didn't let himself process what his instincts were trying to tell him. He didn't care. Ryan stepped in closer, his breath slow, casual, but there was something else in his posture now, something amused. He had seen this before. A black man dressed too well, walking too confidently, carrying himself like he had a right to be anywhere. Ryan's voice carried a mocking sharpness, the kind of condescension that came easy to men like them. His words were empty, just noise, just part of the game. Derek didn't wait for a response. He barely even heard what Ryan was saying. Instead, he tossed the wallet onto the ground. He didn't drop it. He didn't hand it back. He threw it, let it hit the pavement between them like it was nothing. The leather smacked against the concrete, landing face down. The ID inside, the one that could have told him everything he needed to know, remained unseen. Derek felt something dark curl inside him, an irritation he couldn't name, a frustration that had nothing to do with this man specifically, and everything to do with the world that had been shifting beneath his feet for years now. The rules used to be simple. Now everyone wanted to question them. He wasn't interested in questions. The accusations started spilling out, one after the other. Routine, mechanical. Was he loitering? Was he resisting? Did he have something to hide? Each question was less about getting an answer and more about pressing, about making him fold. But the man still didn't flinch. His breathing remained steady, his shoulders didn't tense, his hands remained in view, not moving toward the wallet, not making any sudden gestures. That annoyed Derek even more. He had seen this before, and he knew how to break it. Enough of the act. Enough of the pretense. Derek didn't think. His body just moved. His fingers curled around the can of pepper spray hanging from his belt. It was so easy. There was no hesitation, no reason, no justification, just power, and he used it. He pressed the trigger, his thumb depressing the nozzle, and the thick burning mist exploded forward, straight into the man's face. The reaction was instant. The chemical burn ripped through his eyes, clawing into his throat, his lungs, suffocating, blistering. The man stumbled back, his shoulders jerking upward, his body reacting before his mind even had time to register the pain. A ragged breath, a sharp gasp, a sound caught between shock and agony. His hand shot up instinctively, fingers pressing against his face as his body reeled from the assault. Derek felt nothing but satisfaction. Ryan chuckled, his stance still loose, relaxed, like this was just another night, just another reminder of how the streets worked. Derek had seen this 100 times before, but something was wrong, because the man wasn't pleading, wasn't yelling, wasn't begging for water, for help, for mercy. Even through the unbearable burn, even as his body twitched from the intensity, his posture remained controlled. Derek's smirk faltered slightly. Something about this wasn't right. The man wasn't breaking. Derek's grip on the pepper spray tightened, his mind racing to understand what he was seeing. Then, blindly, the man reached into his pocket. Not frantically. Not like someone panicking. His movements were deliberate, careful, controlled. And even though his vision was gone, his body overwhelmed with pain, he did something that made Derek's pulse stutter. He pulled out a handkerchief, white, neatly folded. He pressed it to his burning, swollen eyes, inhaled through the agony, and with the calmest voice Derek had ever heard through screams, he spoke. He told them to read the ID. Derek's breath hitched. Ryan's body went rigid. For the first time in the entire encounter, Ryan hesitated. Derek's stomach dropped. Ryan crouched down, fingers shaky now as they reached for the discarded wallet, flipping it open, finally reading the words inside. His face drained of color. His lips parted slightly. His throat bobbed. Derek snatched it from him, his eyes darting over the text. And then, his blood ran cold. Julius King, Commissioner of Police. His new boss, the new commissioner, the man he had just blinded. Julius King staggered backward, his body locking up as the chemical burn tore through him. The searing fire in his eyes spread through his throat and lungs, his vision consumed by red-hot agony. His breath came in short, sharp gasps, his chest convulsing as his body reeled from the attack. The pain was immediate, all-consuming, but he had trained his mind to override it. He had been through worse. But Derek Lawson didn't know that. Standing a few feet away, Derek's lips curled as he watched the reaction unfold. Satisfaction settled deep in his chest, an instinctive, familiar thrill rushing through him at the sight of power reclaimed. Ryan Carter smirked beside him, rocking on his heels, arms crossed over his chest. He was waiting for the coughing, for the blind stumbling, for the desperation to set in. But then, something was wrong. The man wasn't pleading. He wasn't begging. Even through the burning agony, even as his shoulders stiffened and his breath hitched, he didn't break. Derek's smirk faltered slightly. Confusion crept in, replacing the sharp edge of arrogance. He had done this before, 100 times, had seen men fold under the unbearable sting of pepper spray, falling to their knees, gasping for relief. That was how this was supposed to go. But this man, even as his body screamed in pain, his movements remained controlled. And then, blindly, he reached into his pocket. Ryan tensed slightly beside him, his hand instinctively grazing his baton. Derek's fingers twitched toward his gun, but the man didn't panic. There was no wild flailing, no disoriented grasping for something to use as a weapon. His fingers found fabric, a simple white handkerchief neatly folded. He pulled it out, smooth and deliberate, pressing it against his swollen, burning eyes. And then, he breathed, slowly, measured, forcing himself to steady. Derek's pulse spiked. This wasn't normal. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. And then the man spoke. His voice was not hoarse, not gasping, not raw with suffering. It was controlled, calm, sharp as a blade slicing through the tension in the air. He told them to read the ID. Derek stiffened. Ryan's smirk vanished. The hand on his baton lowered slightly as his eyes darted to where the wallet lay on the pavement, discarded and ignored. He hesitated. Then slowly, he crouched, his fingers suddenly shaky as he reached for it. He flipped it open, his gaze scanning the words inside. And then, his face drained of color. His lips parted slightly, his throat bobbing as if he were trying to swallow something down. Derek snatched it from him, his hands suddenly cold despite the heat creeping up his neck. His eyes dropped to the ID, reading the text for the first time, and then, his stomach dropped. The name burned into his mind. Julius King, Commissioner of Police. The newly appointed commissioner, the highest-ranking officer in the entire department, the man they had just pepper-sprayed in the face. Derek's breath hitched. His hand twitched, the same hand that had brutalized his superior officer, the same hand that had wielded power so carelessly, so confidently, now frozen in midair as his brain scrambled for an escape. But there wasn't one. Ryan shifted beside him, his breath coming in shallow, uneven bursts. His posture had changed completely, his shoulders rigid, his fingers clenched into a fist so tight his knuckles had gone white. Julius King was still blinded, still in excruciating pain. But now he was smiling. It wasn't amusement. It wasn't even anger. It was something colder, something that promised retribution. And for the first time in Derek Lawson's entire career, he felt something he had never truly felt before. Fear. The squad room was silent. Not the usual kind of silence, not the low murmur of officers on duty, not the occasional burst of laughter from a rookie too green to know better. This was the kind of silence that pressed down, that wrapped around the room like a vice, heavy and unmoving. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed softly, casting a sterile glow over everything. Shadows pooled in the corners, stretching long across the floor, swallowing what little air was left in the room. Derek Lawson and Ryan Carter sat stiffly in their chairs, backs straight, shoulders squared, but the illusion of composure was unraveling fast. Their uniforms were still crisp, their badges still pinned to their chests, but the weight of them had changed. Not symbols of power, symbols of disgrace. Derek's gaze flickered downward, landing on the metallic object on the table in front of him. His badge. It caught the light, shining under the glare of the overheads, looking no different than it had hours ago. But it was different. It had meant something before. It had been his protection, his shield, his right to do whatever he deemed necessary without question, without consequence. Now, it was useless. He forced himself to sit still, even as a deep, crawling heat spread across the back of his neck. He could feel it, the slow, sickening realization setting in. This wasn't going away. Across from them, Commissioner Julius King sat, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. His eyes were still red, irritated from the pepper spray they had unleashed on him, but his vision had cleared enough, and he was looking right at them, not with rage, not with revenge, just cold, calculating certainty. Derek fought the instinct to look away, to drop his gaze like a guilty child caught in a lie. He had spent years training himself never to look weak, never to back down. But right now, for the first time, he felt something claw at his insides, something dangerously close to fear. The statement had already been written. The security footage from a nearby building had already been pulled. The incident, the one that should have ended with Derek in control, had instead unraveled everything in a matter of minutes. It wasn't his word against a nobody's anymore. Julius King wasn't nobody. Julius hadn't yelled, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't needed to. He had simply told the truth, and that truth had been enough. Ryan cracked first. His knee bounced restlessly under the table, his breath coming in sharp, panicked exhales, his fingers twitching against his own badge as if clutching it tight enough would keep it from slipping away. His eyes darted toward Derek, looking for some kind of answer, some kind of way out. Derek ignored him. He sat rigid, his jaw clenched, his fists curled, his mind racing through every possible angle, every possible escape route. Even now, even with everything crumbling, he wanted to believe this wasn't the end. But it was. Because Julius King leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his fingers laced together, his voice measured, calm in a way that made the entire room feel colder. He told them what would happen next, the investigation, the charges, the career-ending humiliation. Derek barely heard the words. His world had shrunk to the size of that badge on the table. All the nights spent patrolling these streets, all the times he had made men like Julius bow their heads, all the moments he had felt untouchable. Gone. Because one moment, one assumption, had turned his badge into nothing more than scrap metal. Julius King didn't gloat. He didn't need to. He had already won. And then, as if he hadn't just dismantled them with a few quiet words, he stood. He reached for his coat, smoothing it over his shoulders, his movements unhurried, deliberate. And before walking out of the room, he spoke one last time. The words were simple, almost conversational, but they cut deeper than any punishment ever could. "You thought I was nobody." The sentence hung in the air, pressing into the silence like a final nail in a coffin. And then, without another glance, he walked out the door. The heavy metal clicked shut behind him, leaving Derek and Ryan alone in a room where power no longer belonged to them.